does anyone have any questions around tech skills, coding, hiring? Yeah, I mean, I know there's been a few other discussions. I was in Alex's one prior to that, so I don't know what happened in your one, Bruno, but
Krista, how you deal with the pressure, demand of keeping up with new tools, languages, etc.? You don't?
I don't. I think one thing about the pressure and the demand of keeping up with tech is that I think you straight away have to realize that you're never going to know everything, and the moment you learn something and you get comfortable with it, it changes. So for example, like I finished uni 8 years ago and I spent my final year learning Objective-C, 8 months specializing in this language, building apps. 4 months later, Apple brought out what was that new language called? The new one. Swift, yeah.
Swift.
They literally brought out Swift, and then I was like, well, now I guess. But I think the main thing to understand is that the skills that you learn are still there. Like that, it still helped me understand programming in various different ways. Yeah, like Chris said, it learns you, like it teaches you how to teach yourself, and tech moves at such a fast pace that it's one of the most exciting things about being in tech is that things are always changing and things are updating, but it's you're never going to know everything. Yeah, and hopefully you'll work at a company where they allow you to have a bit of that time where you can learn a bit. I know a few companies do 10 or 20% time where you can spend a bit of time learning a new skill if you want. I don't know if you've got anything to add, Bruno.
Yes, so a couple of things. So first thing is I'll second what you said about languages. I got my degree in 94, which is old. And within 3 years of having my degree, I was working with a computer language that did not exist when I had my degree. That was Java. Because, I got my degree before Java existed. And within 5 years of getting my degree, I was working in an industry that did not exist when I had my degree. Because basically, I got my degree before the web really started. 5 years later, I was working in internet banking. That did not exist when I got my degree. So you will find that all the time. On the other hand, there are some concepts that stay stable.
Yeah.
Object-oriented languages all look similar. If you've learned the concept of object-oriented languages with, say, C#, applying it to Java or applying it to Python is exactly the same. Same thing for functional languages, they work the same way. So if you've done, I don't know, some Lisp, for instance, understanding Elm or Elixir is reasonably straightforward.
Yeah.
And the concepts like how do you break down your code? So that's the other session happening at the moment with Pavel. Or if you know how to test your code, testing will work across technologies. Debugging your code will work across technologies and that sort of thing. So there are a lot of the outward things evolve, but the principles inside tend to stay the same.
Yeah.
Or evolve a lot less fast, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. And it's quite likely as well that the job, particularly if you're in tech, the job you're doing in 5 years may not exist at the moment. Like you said, you graduated and then, was doing something different a couple of years later. Like the high chance is that the job you will be doing in 5 years may not exist at the moment. And so another question's coming. What's your take on learning languages versus frameworks? Interesting.
I'd say languages tend to stay, framework work on top of languages. Therefore, a language will stay longer.
Yeah.
So, for example, Python is 30 years old at least. It's not a new language, but you've had a number of frameworks, yeah, Django, Flask, Fast API, whatever. And the frameworks evolve. I mean, the worst offender with this is JavaScript, where you've got a new framework every week.
I was about to say that. And that's the thing with Java. I come from more of a JavaScript background where, you know, my baseline understanding of JavaScript, I say baseline, I've been doing it now for 8 years, but my baseline knowledge is there. And so when something like React came out, like I knew HTML, I knew JavaScript. So learning like JSX, for example, was kind of an amalgamation of the two. Like it wasn't completely alien to me because I had that knowledge. And you know, another framework, JavaScript framework, will probably come out in the next 2 years, and I'll look at the syntax documentation and go, oh, okay, well, you know, some of this, like most of this is familiar to me, but there are some things that are different. And so it's just transferable because I have that base understanding. And I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing to jump straight into something like React. Like, again, I can talk as more of the JavaScript background because that's my background. Like, I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. Like, and the one thing I will say in tech is that everyone has strong opinions on everything. So you will hear someone say, no, absolutely learn vanilla JavaScript first. And you may hear someone go, no, actually learning React is completely fine. Like, there are so many people with so many different opinions that as long as you're learning something, whether it's vanilla JavaScript or React first, like it's fine. Like, you're learning, like that's the main thing. And like you've learned React and then another JavaScript framework comes out, because React has had such an impact on the JavaScript community, it will probably be very similar.
Yes, that's exactly what I was going to say, because at the end of the day, every framework tends to be there to solve a particular problem with that people have struggled with.
Yeah.
And the way they solve it tend to be an amalgamation of solutions that have evolved over the years.
Yeah.
So React has a way to solve a particular problem about doing single page application, all that sort of things. It's basically all the complication you have when you do single page application, where you end up writing a lot of boilerplate code if you do that in vanilla JavaScript. They solved it in one way, and they basically made it into a framework. And if you look at Vue Js is not dissimilar to React. It works slightly differently, but it's the same concept. And same thing on the back end. If you look at Django works in a very similar way to Express in JavaScript, and they work in a very similar way to Java Spring and all that sort of things, because they solve the same category of problems in slightly different ways, but the principles are the same. What is TypeScript and why was that introduced after JavaScript? Oh, we're opening a can of worms here.
We're now going to start talking about functional programming.
No, TypeScript is not functional programming. TypeScript is basically JavaScript with types, with type annotations.
I mean, sure.
And it's funny because
every person I've worked with who has ever introduced TypeScript into my JavaScript project is because they want to do more functional programming.
Yeah, but basically JavaScript like Python are two languages that you can use either object-oriented or functional. Yes, TypeScript gives you generic types that are quite well suited to functional programming, but at the end of the day, it is JavaScript with types. And I've been using it on a project recently, and it's true that when using the types effectively, it catches some errors that I would otherwise make in my code. So effectively, it catches some. It allows me to express more constraints on my code, which,
for example, a really good example of this is if you've got a type and you've said that type should be a number, because types can be numbers, strings, objects. I'm not going to say the word any, and basically what can happen is if you've said your type is a number and it's returning a string, for example, it will then throw you an error. And that's, I think, where it's at its best, or vice versa, if you've said it's a string and it's returning a number, you can catch some really good bugs in your code that from my experience, that you wouldn't have known if types weren't introduced, particularly with like bigger applications. Like the last project I used it on was at Hive, the British gas thermostat company, and we once we introduced it, and it's a thing that you can slowly introduce. You don't just because you add it to your project, it doesn't have to be used everywhere. Like the really nice thing is you can slowly add it to your project, add it to your files. And it took us like at least like a year to add it into everything. Like it wasn't, because it wasn't made a huge priority. It was more of like, oh, if you go in and like update this component, like make sure it's got types. And so that's why it took us a year. But we were able to catch some really good bugs because we'd said, oh, well, this type is expecting an object, and inside that object it should also have a string and a number. But then sometimes it wouldn't return an object, it would just return a string, and you're like, well, there's a bug here. And that's where we found it like really, really extremely useful for us.
Yeah, so one point on this is that both TypeScript and Python has type annotation as well, allow you to introduce it incrementally. But a strongly typed language like Java has types from the start, so you can't escape it. And you've got to work with it from the start. But also languages that are strongly typed tend to have quite an mature type system, so you should be able to express anything. I would say the side effect of types is that it sometimes leads to swearing at the computer when you've got some type errors that are incomprehensible.
Yep. I think it's got better though. And actually, for anyone who comes into a JavaScript project, you may also come across Flow, which is actually a very, very similar thing to TypeScript. I think it came out before TypeScript, but from my recollection, I don't think it's maintained anymore. But actually, joining a legacy project, there could be Flow instead of TypeScript. But basically, they're very similar things. So for anyone, I think it's been abandoned. Yeah, I think that as well. But just in addition, that like if you join a company and there's legacy code, there could be Flow instead of TypeScript. But again, you can, just a heads up that you may come across Flow instead of TypeScript.
Yeah, that's probably because TypeScript is actually done by Microsoft, and Microsoft has way more technical resources than anybody else.
And money.
So...
and money. I mean, they're probably paying a team to like, and I think it goes down to documentation as well. Like the reason why I think TypeScript was able to continue going over Flow, and again, this from my experience, was that the documentation was better, and if the documentation is bad, then people were abandoning Flow in favor of TypeScript. And I'm talking about, I think when we started using it, it was like 3 years ago. Like we abandoned Flow and changed to TypeScript because the documentation and community around it was easier to follow. And there's a TypeScript team within Microsoft.
I agree with Chris. I've been swearing at the TypeScript documentation because I find once you know the way around it. I didn't say it was great.
I said it was better than Flow.
Yeah.
So
yes.
I didn't say it was perfect. I said it was better.
Yes. I found it very difficult to get started with it. Once you know your way around it. Yeah, because they don't really have, they've got a number of chapters about, go here if you're a JavaScript developer, go here if you're that type of developer, but they don't have a getting started from scratch, which is what I was looking for.
Yeah.
And
I'll drop a link to the website now. I've just got it up. Just for anyone who wants to have a quick look at what it is. I've just shared the link for TypeScript.
Yeah, so I agree with Chris that the documentation for TypeScript is not ideal, but it's still probably, it may be better than others.
And it's and why, and also when I say like the community was better, that I remember trying to Google problem when we had Flow before TypeScript, was I remember trying to Google problems and the answers were all just TypeScript. And so that's why we abandoned it. But like I say, like you may come across a legacy project that's got it. But so yeah. Any other questions?
Oh, there's one thing I wanted to add while Chris was talking about documentation. Documentation is so important for projects like this to evolve, and I think that's one of the reasons why Java has stayed so long. You can love or hate Java. The API documentation is extremely extensive.
Yeah.
And once you know your way around it, it is everything is in there.
Yeah. It is quite. I remember thinking that whole type system in JavaScript was quite a learning curve, because it's not. It didn't feel like for me an immediate natural JavaScript thing to be doing types.
No.
But I remember like after a couple of months of like, and like I say, like we slowly amended our project to it. I then started to get the hang of it, and and luckily I was in a team where we were all kind of learning it together. And so we would get stressed, and we would pair program together and stuff, and yeah, it's useful if you need it. Krista, whatever you are learning, find a community, find a language framework with a strong community, good documentation. I think good documentation is like so key.
Yeah. So Erica, what do you think about the case that 20 years after Oracle bought Java, they've now started to charge? I'm not sure what they're charging for though, because Java you have OpenJDK, which is an open source version of it. So, but yes, you always have the danger that when you've got a single company that pushes something, they may at some point start charge for it. And yes, the same thing could happen with Facebook and React, although it's fairly there's always a risk. But when you've got a language or a framework that is fairly successful, so in the Java world, there was a lot of backwards and forwards with the Apache Foundation and Java and Oracle. When Oracle bought Java, out of this you got OpenJDK that came out. So if it's useful enough, there will usually be an open source alternative at some point. But yeah, very few companies manage to get a good business model on top of open source. Well, no, that's not true. Some companies do it well, but others less so. And Oracle is a big offender, I would say. Just only tried to download a Girin, there was a warning about charging.
Oh.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure about that one. I've never paid for Java, but I use OpenJDK, so I use the open source version of it. So I'd say it's the same for every project. You have to look at the community behind it. So if you take the example of Java is not just Oracle, even though they are the primary custodian, I would say, of Java. You've got big companies like IBM who have invested a lot in Java, and a lot of very large companies have invested in it. And the whole Apache Foundation as well has a lot of stuff that is based on Java. They support the Maven repository and everything. So there is enough of a community around Java that if one of them decides to charge, you will have an alternative. As how you say, Go is probably more of a risk because there is not a community around Go like there is around Java yet. So if Google decided to make it proprietary tomorrow, there's no real alternative. So Facebook and React is, you also have the danger that, yes, they could make React closed source, but then React is one level above because it's a framework, it's not a language. So if Facebook were to make React closed source tomorrow, go to Vue Js.
Yeah.
It's the transfer is not massively complicated.
And I don't think Facebook would do that because for that reason. Like I think people would go, oh well, we'll just start using Vue instead then. Like,
yeah, exactly. So a healthy ecosystem, when you've got a lot of options, is more likely to keep all the options free and open, because if you start closing them, people will move.
Mm-hmm. Any other? Yeah, it's just since Vue 3 came out, Vue and React are extremely similar now. Yeah, fair. Does anyone have any other questions around coding, hiring, learning to code? Codebar. We've got about 10 more minutes left.
Catherine, if you're on, do you have a question?
Pardon?
I was wondering if Catherine is now in the chat and had a question.
Yay!
Oh, excellent.
Yeah, sorry, I've come back and connect to Wi-Fi because I was very bad signal. Sorry about that. Yeah, I don't know. So I did miss a bit because of the signal issue. If you discuss like what other languages will always remain in demand? I know people say that languages like Java will never go out of fashion, even though there's competitors like Kotlin and things like that. Like the ones that will never kind of leave the industry. If that's an okay question.
I think it's hard to predict because I think things in tech are always changing. So it's hard for me to sit here and go, JavaScript will be around for the next 100 years because but like Bruno, like we were talking about earlier, like Python has been around for like 30 years. Like and so many companies use it that I can't imagine it's gonna, even like when I think of like less popular languages, I'm going to say popular languages now, something like PHP. Like PHP nowadays isn't seen as being a core language, but there are so many companies, so many banks that run on PHP that if you learn PHP, you will have a job because there are so many companies and particularly banks still using it, particularly in our lifetime. Like I can't imagine if you spent time learning any that it would be wasted.
Yeah, and I think so. One point that you mentioned, I think, which is important, is that some industries will use a particular language more than others.
Yeah.
So it may. I don't think there's a bad language to learn. It's just it will probably direct you towards different industries. So yes, if you learn PHP, then there's a whole slew of companies that build websites based on WordPress and that sort of things, or on Laravel or whatever. There's a whole ecosystem out there. You'd never be out of a job.
Yeah.
Same thing, a language like Java, because it's been invested in so heavily in the finance industry and in big industries. Java is the new COBOL. It will never disappear.
And even if something does disappear, so back in my uni days, we learned Flash, for example. Like, and Flash isn't used now. Like Flash, most like Apple have abandoned it. Like there's it's not really around. But you wouldn't have. I genuinely believe you wouldn't have CSS animations today if it wasn't for Flash, because it also taught the concept of keyframes. In Flash, everything was a keyframe, and then you would move something and it would be another keyframe, blah, blah, blah. So yeah, I'm not going to know Flash now, and I did my uni course 10 years ago. But once keyframes were a thing in CSS, I remembered, I straight away understood what a keyframe was because I had done it previously. So even if something does go out of existence, i.e. Flash, there are so many things from Flash, animations, keyframes, that are now in CSS, so it's still transferable. Like I still understood, like I say, when I saw that you could do keyframes in CSS, I immediately understood what they were because I'd done it before. I didn't need to go away and try to understand how they worked.
So even if something's kind of deprecated, that the lasting knowledge can be applied to something new. So
yeah, like even if in 5 years no one uses React, like
I hope that doesn't happen.
Like something else will be there. There will be things from React. Like there are certain things that React did that changed front end, that changed JavaScript, that will be in whatever this new thing is. And again, there's probably things in Python, Panda, you know, Java, like these things that, like I was saying earlier, when I learned Objective-C, like haven't written Objective-C in about 7 years. And all the native developers I know that then started learning Swift, there were still things from Objective-C that they took and put into Swift because, there were some things that they wanted to change, but there was also some things there that were really solid. And Krista's saying now concepts and mental models just transfer. So really focus on understanding those. Like there will be things from Objective-C that were in Swift, and there'll be some new things, but it's still transferable, even if Objective-C is now deprecated. I love that someone's put RIP Flash. I genuinely was very sad about that. I mean, yes, times change and tech change, and but again, like there are things that, you know, even jQuery, like there are things that jQuery did that, like particularly like DOM manipulation, that you couldn't do prior with JavaScript. So jQuery, again, it's still used in lots of legacy projects and is still useful to know. It changed certain aspects of the internet, not the internet, but like of building a website, for example.
So to answer Luke's question, is there a list of what those concepts are? No, it's a bit too long. Well, I'd say you could start with the different concept about computer languages like object-oriented programming and functional programming. Those are the foundational blocks upon which the rest is based. And after that, it's I don't know. But another example of cross-pollination between languages, we've talked about Python and Python pandas earlier, but Python pandas is just a Python implementation of the R data frame. So basically, they looked at R, said, "Oh, this piece is cool. Let's build it in Python."
Yeah. Oh.
And
how? But if you look at like any industry, if you look at like, I don't know, like fashion industry or anything like that, like people still think some other people that they think are a good idea, and that basically happens with programming languages and frameworks. It's like, oh, that, like you just said, oh, that's good from R. Let's take that from R and add it here. Like it's we've got 5 minutes left, so I don't know if anyone's got like any other, you know, topic that we can end on, or Catherine, I don't know if there's one other, like something else you want to chat about.
Again, like I don't know if you've already said it, I guess, but things like talking about like a newbie first job, would you say like the most important best practices and like things to take away and things to learn, like what those are in your opinion? I know TDD is probably one of them, as you've already mentioned. Just like prioritizing things like writing good code and like how you do that as a junior, and sort of to get in the habit of doing that, I guess. If that makes sense.
I would say one good habit would be to reread your code from time to time, because the best.
Why would you do that?
Because the best code is the one that other people can understand. And if you can still understand 2 months later what you wrote 2 months ago, it's probably not bad.
I tend to find that if I've been in teams before where someone's wrote like a complex function and like the function name doesn't even really make sense, and they've had to put a comment above the function to tell me what the function does. And I'm like, well, hold on, if I can't understand that, then you need to be better at writing this, because I should be able to understand what this does. So I honestly think like readable code is like one of the, because like again, I can talk about, I'm going to say it with JavaScript, like there's so many fancier things you can do, but it just makes it harder to read. So I don't necessarily think that's being a good developer. I think you have to understand that like you're working with teams. Like I joined a team that had loads of like acronyms for their names and stuff, and I was like, hold on, what's this acronym? Like they had acronym names like for variables, functions, and I was like, what do these even mean? And so stuff like that, like even like naming things is like, it's hard coming up with naming things, but I think that's a really good thing to just get into the habit of doing, because again, like Bruno said, if you've named something bad and you go back to it in 2 months and you don't know what it is, that's going to confuse you. As if you've named it something that's obvious and be as obvious as possible, like then it will be easier to read. Commit messages are another one. Like commit messages are like one of those small things as well that I think, if you know, it's only really when you ever need to go back to a previous commit and you need to find where you added that change. And if your commit messages are like add feature, but don't tell me what the feature is, then it's going to make it really hard. So I think it's small things like that that make that can actually make such a huge difference when being a developer.
Yeah, and as ever, I would say there's gray areas in everything. So you mentioned adding comments to explain what things do. And one of the things I've seen in the value of comments is not to explain what the code does. What the code does should be reasonably straightforward. But sometimes the value of comments is to explain why the code does what it does.
Yeah.
I've got an example in a piece of code I wrote some time ago, where I've got a single line of code which is extremely clear about what it does. But when I looked at it several months afterwards, I was like, I can see what it does. I have no idea why this is correct.
Yeah.
And I took half an hour to reverse engineer what I did. And then I wrote 15 lines of comments above it to explain.
Yeah. Oh, right. We've got 1 minute left, but there's a question coming for you, Catherine. I think you studied at Makers. Do you have any tips for someone in week 3? It's great, but very intense.
Oh, yeah. I can't remember like exactly what happened in that week, but I think it's just like making sure that you internalize the concepts and go over things like programming principles, polymorphs, and things like that. Like going over them with people on your course, like talking to people who are with you, who are working with you, because I think a lot of time it's grouping and pairing. So making sure you just communicate a lot in terms of dealing with the intensity. Yeah.
And good luck. Good luck, Luke. Good luck, Luke.
Yeah, and
okay.
Drink water and have a good night's sleep.
Drink
That's
water and
important.
sleep, yeah. I think that's a good moral for just life in general, whether at Makers or not. Drink more water and sleep more. I think it's a good. Yeah. Oh, well, thank you so much, everyone. That was unplanned and hopefully useful. Bye.